Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to discuss why it's a lot of fun to blame your family for your problems. So this is a question that I received from a listener this week on family systems theory. What I think about it, to what extent does it matter? We will get into it. And essentially what family systems theory is, it was this theory of why we are the way we are that came out more in the 80s. And essentially what it says is, look, you are who you are. The reason why you have your problems or lack of problems is because of how your family affected you or didn't affect you. And of course that makes sense because we spend a lot of time with our families, especially during formative years. So of course it's going to make sense that our family, especially our mom and our dad, are going to have a huge effect on us. But the thing with family systems theory, which is what a lot of perspectives on psychology miss, this is more technically sociology, we will talk about it. What it misses is, yeah, you have your issue that you receive, but it's not what matters isn't how you receive your issue. What matters is, what are you going to do with your issue now? And I know I got a lot of pushback on this because Gabor Mate did a media tour a few months ago, I think back in the summer, September. And I did a couple episodes on him, and this is the mistake that he makes because he's big into talking about generational trauma. That's the current iteration. That's the current buzzword. How family systems theory is presented to the public now. Generational trauma. This trauma that your grandfather had because of how maybe his great grandfather beat him up. Let's look at how this affects you today. And of course, I would never say it doesn't affect you, but how do you manage the issue? It's not how you're affected, it's how you affect yourself. It's how you cultivate a relationship with yourself based on this issue that you have. It's not how others affect you, it's how you affect others. So there's really nothing wrong with what Gabor Mate says or what family systems theory says. It's what it doesn't say. It's like if you the weatherman. You lived on a Southeast Asian island, right? And the weatherman is talking, and a volcano's erupting that day. And you turn on the TV to find out what's going on, and the weatherman's talking about the rain. And it's not like the rain doesn't matter. I mean, that may affect mudslides, which may increase if there's lava flowing everywhere. I don't know. So it's not like talking about the rain doesn't help, but we got to know about the volcano. How much is it erupting? Where's the lava flowing? Do we need to evacuate? What? Well, you're talking about the rain while I'm being burned alive. And you're right. You're right about the rain. Good for you. You can look at weather patterns and cloud formations and do all these calculations. I don't know what climatologists do. What's that called? What do weathermen study? There's some word for it. I forget. Climatologists. I don't think that's right, but so that's the issue. It's like, what are we even talking about? And of course, the key when it comes to understanding this stuff, everybody focuses on, here's how my parents messed me up. And by the way, I've received a bunch of anecdotes from people who've said that, yeah, people have been listening to Gabor Mate, and their takeaway is exactly what I thought their takeaway would be. Is that all they do now is they look at their parents, they have more of an excuse, more of a reason, which really it's an excuse to look at their mom and how their mom messed them up. And of course, if they're in any way perceptive, well, most people will just look at that and lament. But if they're a little bit perceptive, what they'll do is they'll say, here's how my mom messed me up, so I'm not going to mess up my children in that way. And I guess that's a start, but of course that's also a great guarantee that you're going to be exactly like your mom, is the attempt to not be like your mom. You got to look at the issue for what it really is. So that's really the key to understanding family systems theory, generational trauma, or whatever. It's not so much how you're affected by your parents, but it's understanding exactly how you will affect your children. So there's two parts of psychology. And I could say this in a bunch of different ways. I could, frame the two parts in a lot of different ways. But for the sake of this video, this discussion, the two parts are how others affect us and how we affect others. Or, more importantly, how we affect ourselves, how others affect us, and then how we create a relationship with ourselves and how this in turn affects how we treat others. And psychology, I think, at a very a very specific perspective is simply how we affect ourselves, and in turn how we will affect others. But what happened in psychology, what's become the main thrust of psychology, is to philosophical influences that we don't have to get into now, is less psychology and more sociology, which is focused on how others affect us. And of course, sociology broadly is how society affects us. There's different iterations of this. Multiculturalism, how being, how people treat you because of your race in a society and how this affects who you are. Or feminist theory, how being a woman in society in a supposed patriarchy affects who you are. How this gives you issues. And another one of these is family systems theory, how your mom and your dad affected you. And of course, I'm not saying that you can't be affected differently because of your race, because of your sex, because of the family that you came from. Of course you can't be. But again, it's ancillary. And that's the sickness. That's what makes it so insidious, is because you're right about the facts. But simply because you're right about the facts does not mean those facts matter. What does matter, of course, is consciousness. That's it. Like I say, of course these external factors affect you. But the question what ultimately matters is how you affect them. You are given an issue. Of course you're given an issue. And the fact that you have an issue because of your race, because of your sex, because of your family, that's not your fault, right? We're talking about psychology. There's no fault. Of course it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And if you're just focusing on the rain rather than the volcano, you're more likely to be burned alive. And of course, I mean, this kind of indicates, part of what I do a lot of complaining on this channel. And one of the things I complain about is the research and what a waste of time is on much of psychology. Not that all research is wrong, but I think you can see here how a lot of research, even if it's right, it doesn't really matter much. I mean, you can spend your whole adult life researching the differences in, how many siblings you have, how that affects you, where you are, sibling order, how that affects you. You come up with all these Likert scales, come up with all these, very ingenious research models. And you could be right. You could be right about all of it. And you can get very clear about maybe how your order, where you were born, how many older siblings you have versus how many younger siblings you have, how that affects your behavior. But does it really matter? And of course, I question how well you can come up with a valid construct about that, because, of course, there's a lot of variables here. And if there's too many confounds, too many variables that you can't really take note of in a study, then that's going to affect the power of the study. It's going to, lessen the effect size. So of course, I question the validity of your construct if you do study this. But let's say even you get a construct that is valid. I mean, does it really matter? I guess it would matter if we didn't have a consciousness, if we didn't have a way to look at our issues. And this is how I think family systems theory can be helpful, is it's helpful for children. Right? It's helpful for children. In my notes here, it says example eating disorder. I have no idea how I'm going to fit. I guess when I was making these notes, I thought, eating disorder is a great example. How is it a great example? I guess what I would say about eating disorder is it's an effect of a problem. It's really not the problem. The problem is some kind of OCD anxiety. I don't know. I don't even know if that's what I was thinking. Probably not. It seems very orthogonal, even for me. So yeah, family system theory is helpful when you're dealing with children. When you have an 8-year-old and you're looking at his behavior, then it's really important to look at the parents and bring them in and talk with them and say, we need to set up the family in a different way because there's problems with this 8-year-old. Because the 8-year-old does not have a consciousness, not to any real extent that he can manage the issue, right? But, there's this quote by, of course, I love to rip on Stoicism, but But there's this good quotation from Epictetus, and it's not exactly right, but essentially what it says is, life is 10%, it isn't the 10% of that happens to you, it's the 90% of how you respond. And of course this Epictetus quote isn't exactly right, because it's not how you respond. It's how to create a foundation from which you will respond in healthier ways in the future, and this is consciousness. So why don't we focus on consciousness? Well, because there's no real theory of what it is. I mean, because of those philosophical influences in psychology, mainly I would say brute empiricism, just to give you something to look up. Because of these philosophical influences, psychology has given up on consciousness. So the default must be sociology or some iteration thereof, feminism, multiculturalism, family systems theory, generational trauma, these being the popular ones. So clearly, in these kinds of therapies, they don't take consciousness into consideration at all. And in fact, part of the therapy, and this is quite explicit, part of the therapy is activism. Social activism is part of your healing process. So if this is like a feminist theory, you go out and do whatever you can to overthrow the patriarchy. That's part of the therapy. Same thing with multiculturalism therapy. But you'd say, well, what about cognitive behavioral therapy? I mean, cognitive is in the name. Of course, CBT at least considers that you have a consciousness. Well, not really. It rightly points to the fact that you can change, or at least what psychology is ultimately about is to the extent you can change. But with the cognitive behavioral therapy triangle, right, there's cognition, emotion, behavior. How do you change your behavior? Well, look to the emotion and cognition. How do you change your cognition? Look to the emotion and behavior. You're really not understanding the root of the issue. You're just kind of doing a lateral move, which doesn't really explain anything. So the implication of cognitive behavioral therapy is you don't have a consciousness. That's why I'm here, to talk about consciousness. Why the tagline of my book, why the subtitle is The Guide to Consciousness. What is it? The Integrated Principles. God, that's a much better way of saying it. The Integrated Principles of Consciousness and Liberty. Of course, I got my book here. You can get it on Amazon. And that's what we talk about, is we break down consciousness to its fundamental parts, work on those parts, and whatever the issue is, it will take care of itself. Those fundamental parts is not how your mom affected you. But that's a good thing to talk about in therapy, is how your mom affected you, because this just gives you more perspective. This gives you more understanding of the issue. And once we're more clear on what the issue is, this tells us how to manage it. But we need to know how emotions work. We need to know the unconscious process that leads to your symptoms, your negative symptoms in the first place. Yeah, before we do that, we got to first learn what emotions are and how exactly they work. I discuss that in my book. Again, pick that up on Amazon. And I apply those principles in therapy. So you can read my book. If you're interested, reach out to me. We do free consultations. animusempire.com/schedule. Thank you, guys. And remember that psychology without consciousness is only emotional indulgence.